You probably believe you understand why you do the things you do. You think your decisions come from clear reasons. You choose something. Then you explain it. Simple, but psychology has a quiet suspicion about this story. The suspicion is that the explanation often comes after the decision, not before. For a long time, psychologists noticed something strange when they asked people why they made certain choices. The answers sounded confident, thoughtful. And yet, when researchers secretly changed parts of the situation, the decisions changed too, but the explanations didn't. People would calmly justify choices they never actually made. In some experiments, participants were asked to choose between two objects, two photos, two products, sometimes two faces. They pointed to one, that then something subtle happened. Without the participant noticing, the experimenters switched the object. Now the participant was holding the other option. And then came the question, why did you choose this one? Most people didn't notice the switch. They didn't hesitate. They simply explained their decision. They described details they supposedly preferred. The color, the expression, the design, the feeling it gave them. But they hadn't chosen it. Their mind didn't detect the change. Instead, it quietly built a story, a convincing one, that this reveals something uncomfortable. Your brain is extremely good at producing explanations, but it is not always good at detecting the real cause of your actions. You don't just make decisions, you also narrate them, and sometimes the narration is so smooth, so confident, that even you believe it. The strange part is that these experiments didn't involve deception on a massive scale. There were no elaborate tricks, no complicated setups, just small manipulations, tiny changes in what a person thought they had done, and yet those tiny changes exposed a gap between what the mind does and what it thinks it does. Most people imagine their mind as a transparent system. You decide, you know why, you explain. But these experiments suggest something different. The mind might be less like a window and more like a storyteller. A storyteller that begins speaking after the event has already happened. And if that's true, then one uncomfortable question immediately appears. If you can't fully see the causes of your own decisions, what else might be shaping them? Most people believe their moral limits are stable. You imagine a line you would never cross. A point where you would simply say no to no matter who asks. No matter what pressure is applied. It feels obvious. But psychology became interested in a disturbing possibility. What if that line moves, not through force, not through threats, but through something far quieter, authority? In several psychological studies, participants believed they were helping with a learning experiment. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple task involving questions and answers. One person would answer questions. Another person would administer consequences for mistakes. The consequences gradually increased. At first, the participants hesitated. They questioned what they were doing. They looked uncomfortable. Some even laughed nervously, as if the situation didn't quite make sense. But something subtle kept the experiment moving forward. A calm voice in the room. An authority figure, not shouting, not threatening, just a steady reassurance. The experiment requires that you continue. And something remarkable happened. Many participants kept going. Not because they suddenly became cruel, not because their personality changed, but because the structure of the situation shifted responsibility. When an authority figure takes ownership of the outcome, the mind performs a quiet adjustment. It begins to see itself less as the source of the action and more as the instrument. The person administering the action is still physically involved. Their hand presses the button. Their voice delivers the instruction. But psychologically, the responsibility has moved somewhere else. Up the hierarchy. This shift is small, but its consequences are enormous. Because morality often depends on one assumption, that people see themselves as the authors of their actions. Remove that assumption, and behavior starts to change. Participants in these experiments often showed visible distress. Sweaty hands, hesitation, quiet protests, and yet many continued. Afterward, when asked why they had gone so far, their answers were surprisingly consistent. They didn't say they wanted to harm someone. They said something simpler. The experimenter told me to continue. In other words, the authority did not force the action. It redefined it. And once the definition changed, the mind adapted. You like to believe your choices come from inside you. Your preferences, your personality, your values. The world around you may influence things a little, but the final decision feels personal, owned. But many psychological experiments quietly challenge this idea. They show that behavior can change dramatically with something as simple as a shift in environment. Not new beliefs, not new information. Just a different setting. Imagine walking into a room where everyone else is giving the same answer to a question. A simple one. Something visual. Something obvious. You see the correct answer clearly, but every person before you gives the same incorrect response, one after another. Calmly. Confidently. Now the room is quiet, it's your turn. Nothing physical is stopping you from giving the correct answer. No punishment waits for disagreement. No authority figure is demanding conformity. And yet something begins to happen in your mind. A small hesitation. Maybe you misread the question. Maybe everyone else noticed something you didn't. The environment has created a subtle pressure. Not through force, through consensus. Experiments built around situations like this produced a consistent pattern. When people were alone, they answered correctly almost every time. But when surrounded by a unanimous group giving the wrong answer, something changed. A surprising number of participants agreed with the group, even when the error was obvious. What makes this result unsettling is not the mistake itself. It's how quickly perception adapts to the environment. Some participants later reported that they knew the group was wrong, but didn't want to stand out. Others said something even stranger. They began to doubt their own eyes. The environment didn't just influence their behavior. It started reshaping their perception. This reveals something deeper about the mind that we often imagine thinking as a private process, happening entirely inside the brain. But in reality, thinking is deeply social. The presence of other people becomes part of the cognitive system. Their confidence, their agreement, their silence, all of it feeds into your interpretation of reality, and once enough signals point in the same direction, the mind begins adjusting. Not because it is weak, because it evolved to trust the group, which leads to a difficult realization. Sometimes the environment around you isn't just influencing your decisions, it's quietly helping make them. You probably believe your personality is stable. You may adapt slightly to different situations. You might behave more formally at work, more casually with friends. But underneath those adjustments, you assume the same person remains in control. Psychology once tested that assumption in a very simple way. Instead of asking people to describe who they were, researchers placed them inside a structure with roles. Some participants were assigned one role. Others were assigned its opposite. The assignments were random. No personality tests. No special screening. Just a role, and then the environment did the rest. The roles came with expectations, rules, a hierarchy, subtle signals about how each side was supposed to behave. At first, the participants treated the situation lightly. They joked. They laughed at the artificiality of it. After all, they knew it was just an experiment. But something changed as the hours passed. The structure of the environment began shaping behavior. Participants placed in positions of authority started acting more assertive, more controlling, sometimes even harsh. Participants placed in subordinate roles became quieter, more compliant, more hesitant. No one had instructed them to behave this way. The roles themselves carried the instructions, and gradually, those instructions began rewriting behavior. The most unsettling part is how quickly this shift can occur. People who had met only hours earlier began interacting as if the roles had existed for years. Authority figures enforced rules more strictly than necessary. Subordinates accepted treatment they would normally question. The situation stopped feeling like a performance. It started feeling real. Not because the individuals had changed internally, but because the structure around them had changed what behaviors felt appropriate. In other words, the environment wasn't just influencing choices. It was shaping identity. The role became a script, and once the script was in place, the mind did something remarkable. It began acting as if the script had always been there. At this point, a comforting explanation might come to mind. Maybe people behave differently in these experiments because they feel trapped in strange situations. Maybe they simply go along with the structure until it ends. And afterward, they return to normal, but something more subtle often happens. After the experiment is over, participants are usually asked a simple question. Why did you do what you did? The answers are rarely confused. They are calm, logical, reasonable. Participants describe their motives as if the decisions had been carefully considered from the beginning. Someone who followed the authority figure explains that they believed the task was important. Someone who agreed with the group says they genuinely thought the others might be right. Someone who adopted a harsh role explains that the situation required discipline. The explanations sound sincere. Because they are. The participants are not lying. Their minds are reconstructing. This is one of the brain's most powerful abilities. When an action occurs, the mind often builds a story around it afterward. A narrative that makes the behavior feel intentional and consistent with the person's identity. Without that narrative, the action would feel random, uncomfortable, even frightening. So the brain quietly edits the past, not by changing the memory itself, but by changing the interpretation. Psychologists sometimes describe this process as rationalization, but the word can be misleading. It suggests a conscious effort to justify something. What often happens is much more automatic. The mind searches for a reason that fits the action, and once it finds one, the explanation feels completely genuine. This is why people can participate in situations that conflict with their expectations of themselves, and still leave believing their behavior made sense. The narrative repairs the contradiction. It restores the feeling that the self is coherent and rational. But when many experiments produce the same pattern, a deeper possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the mind is not simply making decisions and explaining them. Perhaps it is constantly adjusting the story of who you are, so that your past behavior appears consistent, even when the real cause was something outside you. A situation, an authority, an environment, or a role. Individually, each of these experiments can be dismissed. Point 1 shows people trusting authority too easily. Another shows people conforming to a group. Another reveals how roles shape behavior. You might look at each result and think, that situation was unusual. But psychologists eventually noticed something unsettling. The pattern repeated everywhere. Change the details, change the setting, change the task. The outcome often remained the same. Behavior shifted dramatically depending on the situation people were placed in, not slowly. Quickly. People who believed they were compassionate could act harshly inside certain structures. People who believed they were independent could conform when surrounded by confident agreement. The mind adapted to the environment faster than personality could resist it. This challenges one of our most comfortable beliefs about human nature. We like to think behavior comes from character. Someone acts generously because they are a generous person. Someone acts cruelly because they are cruel. It feels morally satisfying. It keeps the world understandable, but these experiments quietly suggest something different. In many situations, behavior emerges from the interaction between a person and the structure surrounding them. Change the structure, and behavior can change with surprising speed. This does not mean character is meaningless, but it may not be the dominant force we imagine. A person standing alone with their values might behave one way. That same person placed inside a powerful situation, authority, group pressure, defined roles, might behave very differently. The disturbing part is how invisible these influences often are. Participants rarely noticed them while they were happening. From the inside, their behavior felt reasonable, natural, even justified. Only later, when the structure was removed, did the situation reveal how much it had shaped their actions. And this leads to a quiet but difficult realization. If behavior can be altered so easily by context, then the mind you trust most, your own, may be far more dependent on circumstances than it appears. You like to believe that your mind is a stable place, a private theater where your thoughts, choices, and morals play out according to your own script. But these experiments whisper a different story. Your decisions are not born solely from intentions or values. They emerge from a subtle network of influences: the environment, authority, roles, and the social cues around you. At times, your mind follows its own compass. At other times, it surrenders quietly, without protest, to pressures you barely notice. Even more unsettling, the mind itself repairs these inconsistencies. It produces explanations, narratives, and reasons after the fact, so that you believe in your own rationality. You cannot always trust the sense of control you feel. You cannot always trust the explanations your mind offers. And yet, this is not a failure. It is a feature. Your brain has evolved to maintain coherence, to navigate the world without collapsing under uncertainty. What these experiments quietly reveal is a deeper truth. Humans are creatures of context, adaptation, and self-narration. You are not just a mind making choices. You are a mind continuously shaped by the world, by authority, by roles, and by invisible social forces, constantly interpreting, adjusting, and justifying itself. And perhaps the most profound realization is this: the person you believe you are may be only partly yours. Most of it is still being written, silently, by the world around you, and by the mind you trust, which is never quite finished. The awe comes not from helplessness, but from the elegance of it. A mind not as rigid as it seems, not as predictable as it claims, but astonishingly adaptive, quietly narrating its own story while the world unfolds around it.